US-Israeli threats against Iran and the geopolitics of World War III. I'm going to be talking about four distinct subjects, and in a kind of accelerating way. The first one is media deceptions, and because I'm going to be referring to some quite precise textual details, I'll be reading a good chunk of that. I'll then move on to the question of the economic and political instabilities that make war tempting for the United States and Israel. I'll be much briefer there, and of course more speculative. I'll have a little bit to say on a third subject, the likely plans of attack and defense should there be a war. And fourthly, I'll have a little bit to say about the geopolitics that again are at play. I want to start with a quotation from someone I think who could be described as a kind of intellectual hero of our time, Julian Assange, who in a recent interview with Rolling Stone magazine said, quote, "I believe that if we look at what makes a civilization civilized, it is people understanding what is really going on. All human systems require authority, but authority must be granted as a result of the informed consent of the governed. Presently, the consent, if there is any, is not informed, and therefore it's not legitimate." So, media deceptions. My subject is an alarming one. The possibility, some analysts would say the growing likelihood, that American and Israeli threats of war against Iran will lead in short order not just to open war in the Middle East. I think there's a covert war that's already going on, that's very clear, but to great power conflict as well. I don't intend to make rash predictions, but the possibility of an expanding war is one that should be taken very seriously. My point of entry will be an analysis of current aggressive propaganda in the United States. But the words I've quoted from investigative journalist Julian Assange's recent interview with Rolling Stone suggest that it might be useful to begin with some reflexive questions about the state of our own collective self-knowledge. How much do Canadians understand of the goings-on of our own government here at home, let alone in Haiti or Afghanistan or Libya, three countries in which our armed forces have openly intervened during the past decade? Can the Canadian interventions in those countries be fairly described as, in Assange's word, civilized? And in what sense can we be said to have consented to them? Did we consent to, were we even told about the very large-scale participation of Canadian naval units in the 2003 war against Iraq? Have we been consulted as to their likely participation in the impending war on Iran? We're ruled in this country by a majority government, elected last May by 40% of the 60% of the electorate who voted. How informed was the consent of that not quite 25% of the electorate? If the electorate as a whole has been deceived, misinformed, or simply deflected from relevant truths, what degree of legitimacy could the consent of even a much larger percentage confer upon governing authorities? And what then, in parentheses, of the United States, where many citizens find the acknowledged truthiness of Stephen Colbert, Jon Stewart, and The Onion preferable to the mendacity of mainstream news sources, and where the formal process of obtaining consent, marked as it is by unconstrained power of corporate money over the electoral process, as well as by massive and systematic right-wing electoral fraud, has become openly farcical. In what we're still pleased to call democracies, consent to the degree it may exist is manufactured. We learned that lesson a quarter century ago, if we didn't know it already, from Edward Herman's and Noam Chomsky's classic Manufacturing Consent. Chomsky and Herman explained the manufacture of consent through what they call a propaganda model, whose basic transaction, and this is counterintuitive, is the sale of audiences or readerships by news corporations to their advertisers. Within a system in which the information stream undergoes multiple filterings by structures of concentrated and interlocking corporate ownership, by corporate advertisers who may well be among the owners, by government and corporate agencies whose massive output of propaganda scripts, videos, press releases, and not-for-attribution interviews provides a major part of the content which the media purvey as news, by disciplinary structures, including organizations and foundations devoted to enforcing ideological conformity, and finally, more diffusely, by the institutionalized ideology of anti-communism. They were writing in the late 1980s. This is, of course, supplanted since 2001 by the overlapping neo-imperial ideology of the so-called War on Terror. Robert McChesney, who's a leading contemporary scholar of media analysis, has described the period from the 1950s to the 1970s as a golden age of professional journalism in the United States, a time when journalists had relative autonomy and considerable resources to pursue their craft. Now, that autonomy, those resources are by and large long gone. And there may be some irony if we think of the fact that a very large proportion of the Chomsky-Herman book, Manufacturing Consent, is devoted to testing of their propaganda model with detailed case studies of the ways in which, during those same golden year decades, the corporate media worked in support of American aggressions in Indochina. But Robert McChesney, of course, understands very well the ways in which corporate media have been used to facilitate wars of aggression. He remarked, for example, that during the weeks leading up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, a mere 3% of American sources appearing on US television news were opposed to the war, while more than 70% were decidedly pro-war. During the 3 weeks after the invasion, the ratio of pro to anti-war sources on NBC, ABC, CBS, PBS, CNN, and Fox was 25-1. In discussing what he calls the asininity of much of what passes for contemporary political journalism, McChesney writes, in January 2008, a comprehensive study by the nonpartisan Center for Public Integrity determined that there were fully, and they counted this up, 935 lies, with several hundred coming from President Bush and Vice President Cheney, told to the American people to generate popular support for a war in Iraq. These weren't gray area statements, as the CPI's, Center for Public Integrity's, detailed database makes clear, nor were they oversights or clumsy missteps. As the report concludes, the lies, quote, were part of an orchestrated campaign that effectively galvanized public support, public opinion, and in the process led the nation to war under distinctly false pretenses. Now, two recent incidents can give some measure both of the major corporate media's continuing decline from any supposed watchdog function into what one might call stenographic propaganda, and also of the mounting pressures to purge participants in the new electronic media who might aspire to take up a more critical stance. Here's the first one. January 12th, 2002. New York Times public editor, that's a kind of ombudsman. The Toronto Star has a public editor who fills the same function. Arthur Brisbane asked for, quote, reader input on whether and when New York Times reporters should challenge, in his own quotes, facts that are asserted by newsmakers they write about. Now, the title of his article, Should the Times Be a Truth Vigilante, suggested that any such challenge would be improper. He got more input back than he'd expected. Quote, when did truth-telling and fact-checking become novel ideas? Demanded one blogger. Glenn Greenwald at Salon.com proposed putting Brisbane's words, quote, on the wall of a museum to explain contemporary US journalism. Jerry Ianson at Op-Ed News noted that the lies of newsmakers, so-called, can be exposed by the very simple expedient of providing context. What's so difficult about the concept of context? Without it, he says, without measuring statement against background and fact, the so-called news is little more than a firing range. At nearly the same time, another controversy showed the present-day workings of what Chomsky and Herman call the disciplinary and ideological filters at work in the manufacture of consent. A media smear campaign of false accusations of anti-Semitism, organized by former American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, that's AIPAC for short, spokesman Josh Block, against analysts and journalists at two organizations, Media Matters and the Center for American Progress, or CAP. The story appeared in mid-December 2001, or at least his project appeared to have backfired. He was publicly exposed. He was actually expelled by the Democratic Party-aligned Truman National Security Project, for which he worked, for using mischaracterization or character attacks in order to impede, as they put it, the ability to debate difficult topics freely. So that seemed to be a good outcome. A month later, Glenn Greenwald wrote that the disgusting smear campaign rolled on undeterred. Block's smears against, Greenwald says, mostly young liberal writers at CAP's Think Progress blog and at Media Matters were taken up by Ben Smith at Politico, by Jennifer Rubin in the Washington Post, supported by the Simon Wiesenthal Center, by Benjamin Weintal in the Jerusalem Post, quoting the far-right Jerusalem-based NGO Monitor, as well as the Wiesenthal Center, by Daniel Greenfield in David Horowitz's Islamophobic Front Page magazine, by Alana Goodman, who wrote in the New York Post that the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee had joined the Wiesenthal Center in, quote, accusing CAP and its staff of publishing anti-Israel, hateful, and toxic anti-Jewish material, unquote. The offending writers, were fired. Block, meantime, represented himself as a defender of civility, and I think his words are interesting. As a progressive Democrat, I'm convinced that on issues as important as the US-Israeli alliance and the threat posed by Iran's nuclear program, there is no room for uncivil discourse or name-calling like Israel Firster or Likudnik, and policy or political rhetoric that is hostile to Israel or suggests that Iran has no nuclear weapons program has no place in mainstream Democratic Party discourse. I believe that when it occurs, progressive institutions have a responsibility not to tolerate such speech or arguments. And he hopes that going forward, quote, we will see a more civil discourse on these issues from leading progressive institutions. Of course we will, if the people he smears as anti-Semites or pro-Iranian have been purged and silenced. And of course the pious posturing about doing away with hateful or uncivil discourse is unaffected by the facts that as of December 2001, there was no evidence that Iran actually had a nuclear weapons program, or the other fact that in January 2012, as we'll shortly see, US Defense Secretary Leon Panetta and Israeli intelligence sources both stated categorically that Iran did not have a nuclear weapons program. It may not come, by the way, as a complete surprise that also in January 2012, Reporters Without Borders, Reporters Sans Frontières, listed the United States in 47th place, tied with Romania and Argentina in its annual ranking of press freedom. Former CIA officer Philip Giraldi's assessment of the present situation is bleak. Quote, no matter how one feels about Iran's government and its ambitions, he wrote in mid-December of last year, everyone should be taking notice of what is happening to fuel the drive to war. The drumbeat is incessant, fed by weekly warnings from leading Israeli politicians and truculent editorials and poorly informed op-eds in leading American newspapers. The American people are being told over and over again that Iran is developing a nuclear weapon, that Tehran is threatening US soldiers, and that Ahmadinejad has pledged to wipe Israel off the map. Alluding to a larger scale pattern, Giraldi repeats, quote, as Washington has demonstrated itself unwilling to negotiate with Iran over outstanding issues and has refused every attempt by the Iranians to compromise. And there's one very signal example of that from 2010 that I'd be happy to go into in some detail, perhaps later on. I quote again, there can be only one outcome to the game that is being played, and that is war, unquote. Now, in a more recent essay published on February the 8th, Giraldi analyzes the strategy for ensuring consent that has been adopted by the American government, including the leaders of both political parties, by the Israeli government, by a major part of the corporate media in both countries, as well as by other components of what I'm calling the disciplinary and ideological apparatuses. What do you do, Giraldi asks, if you want a war, but your intelligence services tell you, quote, that Iran does not have a nuclear device and has not made the political decision to build one, unquote? Here's his answer. You shift your narrative and develop a new way of defining the threat. Israel and its friends have consequently initiated a major offensive, both back at home and in the United States, to heighten the impression that Iran poses a genuine threat to Israel, the United States, and even to world peace in general. The new narrative, Giraldi says, goes roughly as follows. Iran is developing a nuclear weapon and is close to having one, despite what those intelligence people think. The weapon will inevitably be used by Iran directly or else given to terrorists to threaten Israel, Europe, and even the United States, using ballistic missiles that are currently being developed. Because Iran is concealing or defensively hardening its new nuclear facilities, the window is closing on a military option to destroy the program. Now, to make a preemptive attack doubly necessary, Giraldi adds, this, what he calls major disinformation strategy involving diplomatic intelligence and media resources, unquote, includes the claim that Iran, quote, is also planning to attack Jewish and American targets worldwide, including inside the United States, unquote. Now, the present situation is complicated by the dynamics of the US presidential election, which include, I think quite interestingly, what Max Blumenthal describes as this is a really excellent article, as a political shadow campaign organized by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the goal of which is, quote, helping the Republicans oust Obama from the White House. The strategy is, of course, to make unconditional support for Israel a wedge issue, representing the president as a weakling whose attempts to evade, quote, the confrontation with evil, you know who that means, may bring a second Holocaust, unquote. Those words, by the way, are not from Netanyahu. They're from Newt Gingrich, Republican candidate. And they're quoted by Blumenthal, and this gives an idea of some of the linkages at work, from a front-page spread in the Israeli tabloid Israel Hayom, which he says is referred to Israelis as the Bibiton, or Bibi's mouthpiece, and as one source of his extraordinary political leverage in Israel. Not coincidentally, Blumenthal adds, this newspaper is owned by Las Vegas tycoon Sheldon Adelson, major political contributor to far right-wing causes, who has bankrolled the political careers both of Bibi Netanyahu and of Newt Gingrich. Now, are these maneuverings having any impact? Gene Lyons, writing at Salon.com on February the 8th, thinks so. He took note of what he said, a skeptical observer might be forgiven for suspecting as a well-coordinated propaganda campaign, namely articles appearing concurrently within 24 hours in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and Bloomberg News, all of them urging a US-Israeli attack on Iran, a matter, as the third article casually puts it, of, quote, some creative destruction. That's that loathsome historian, Neil Ferguson, by the way. I think a really quite seriously despicable person. Or according to the fourth article, attempting to drum up fear, a matter of preventing the possible, quote, obliteration of Israel and its 6 million Jews. That number is, of course, not adventitious. That's a direct allusion to the Shoah. At the outset of the recent round of Republican presidential candidate debates, Rick Santorum declared, quote, anyone who suggests that Iran is not a threat to this country or is not a threat to stability in the Middle East is obviously not seeing the world very clearly. He's seeing it exactly the way that Barack Obama sees it. And here he pointed his finger at fellow Republican candidate Ron Paul. Now, Santorum made an oddly apocalyptic mention of Iran's supposed nuclear weapons aspirations. It's worth sometimes looking at the details of what these people say. Quote, if Rick Santorum and when Rick Santorum is president, Iran will not get a nuclear weapon because the world as we know it will be no more. Oh dear. Perhaps we don't want this man to get his hands on the little red button. He also, of course, touched on some of the other motifs of the propaganda drumbeat, claiming that Iran, quote, is the greatest supporter of terrorism in the Middle East and around the world, a title that Noam Chomsky has for many decades securely awarded to the United States, of course, and that it's setting up camps and plotting with Venezuela and other countries to the south to attack us. The soft underbelly of the United States, one presumes. One's reminded of Ronald Reagan's dire warnings about Nicaragua being a dagger pointed at the heart of the United States. Nearly direct quotation from Adolf Hitler. Ron Paul, the anti-war candidate against whom this diatribe was aimed, responded, and here I wish I could do a sort of squeaky Ron Paul voice, that Iran does not have an air force that can come here. They can't even make enough gasoline for themselves, and here we are building the case up just like we did in Iraq, build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they had nuclear weapons, and we had to go in. I'm sure you supported that war as well. Rick Santorum, who I've omitted his interruptions. There were two of them in the Rick Santorum says, yes. Ron Paul continues, it's time we quit this. It's time. It's trillions of dollars we're spending on these wars. The other Republican candidates look on with expressions of pity or contempt. Now, everyone who attends to the corporate news has heard countless times that Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has threatened since October 2005 to, quote, wipe Israel off the map, and that Iran is busily working to produce nuclear weapons to achieve that genocidal goal. Given the tone and temperature of current public discourse, which we've had some samplings of, any attempt to calmly and critically weigh the best evidence on these subjects may seem doomed. Those who hold power in the United States and in Israel appear determined to pursue a course of action, of criminal aggression, that will predictably lead, in short order, to the violent death of very large numbers of people, the vast majority of them civilians. And we've seen indications of the kinds of smear tactics and defamation deployed by the propagandists of aggression. There's all the more need, then, to insist, as an essential component of democratic citizenship, on what the democracy of ancient Athens called parrhesia, the duty of fearless speech that discloses unwelcome truths in the face of opposing power, even at the risk of social sanctions or punishment. A risk which the parrhesiastes, the speaker of truth, sets aside as unimportant, quote, using his freedom, as the philosopher Michel Foucault wrote, and choosing frankness instead of persuasion, truth instead of falsehood or silence. So let's look at some evidence. First, threats against Israel. Some of you may know this already, but I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on that notorious October 2005 speech, in which I'm going to make use here of a little bit of paraphrase by Arash Nourouzi. Iranian President Ahmadinejad argued, quote, that Zionism is the West's apparatus of political oppression against Muslims and operates, quote, as a strategic bridgehead to ensure American domination of the region and its assets, unquote. Now, by way of demonstrating to his audience that a world without this domination is possible, Ahmadinejad, as a good theocrat, referred to three instances in which the proclamations of the Ayatollah Khomeini, founder of Iranian theocracy, had proved prophetic. The fall of the, quote, corrupt regime of the US-installed Shah of Iran, quote, the dear Imam said that the Shah's regime must go, unquote. Two, the collapse of the supposedly, quote, iron regime of the Soviet Union. Quote, Imam said the rule of the East, USSR, and of the West, US, should be ended, unquote. Three, the destruction of Saddam Hussein's Iraqi dictatorship. Quote, Imam said that Saddam must go and that he would be humiliated in a way that was unprecedented, unquote. To this sequence, Ahmadinejad added a fourth, as yet unfulfilled prophecy. And Farsi speakers here will have to excuse my execrable pronunciation of a transcription. Imam goft in regime ish galgare kods bayad as safaye ruzgar maz shavad. Here's Arash Nuruzi's, was that okay? At least comprehensible, thank you very much. Arash Nuruzi offers a word-for-word translation, and I've reordered the last few words to conform with English word order. Imam goft, Imam Khomeini said, in regime, this regime, ish galgare, occupying Quds, Jerusalem, bayad, must, mav shavad, vanish from, as safye ruzgar, from the page of time. Imam said, this regime occupying Jerusalem must vanish from the page of time. Noting this sentence's relation to the prior citations of Khomeini, Nuruzi proposed that, quote, Ahmadinejad would seem to be calling for regime change, not war, unquote. Jonathan Steele of The Guardian likewise judged that the sentence is not a military threat and found support in the reference to the fall of the Shah's regime for the view that Ahmadinejad was talking, quote, about regime change, not the end of Israel. As a schoolboy opponent of the Shah in the 1970s, he surely did not favor Iran's removal from the page of time. He just wanted the Shah out. Notice in this speech the repeated use of the word regime. University of Michigan Middle East scholar Juan Cole, who offered a translation identical to Nuruzi's, remarked that the Khomeini quotation, quote, does not imply military action or killing anyone at all, unquote. Now, there's some ironies that emerge from a close examination of this notorious sentence. The first is the fact, as Jonathan Steele noted, that Ahmadinejad misquoted Khomeini, saying page instead of stage of time. As it happens, the Farsi words Saneh and Safeh also rhyme. Second irony, Nuruzi remarks that although neither Khomeini nor Ahmadinejad used the word map, nagshe in Farsi, the inflammatory mistranslation, quote, must be wiped off the map, unquote, was first circulated by, of all people, the Islamic Republic News Agency, IRNA, which evidently employs people who know something about idiomatic English, but rather less about the history and connotations of idiomatic expressions. Thirdly, when Ahmadinejad made a similar statement on December 2006, more than a year later, the IRNA, which had by this time I think learned its lesson about the importance of careful translation, reported his words, quote, as the Soviet Union disappeared, the Zionist regime will also vanish and humanity will be liberated, unquote. Now you can see that he's talking about, in effect, it's the same structure of thinking. Here's the irony. The IRNA got it right this time, but the Associated Press promptly and maliciously altered the wording while still sourcing it to the Islamic Republic News Agency, so that Ahmadinejad was now supposed to have said, quote, the Zionist regime will be wiped out soon, the same way the Soviet Union was, unquote. The AP article, Iran, here's the title, Iran President, Israel will be wiped out, unquote, was echoed on the following day by Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post, which reported that Ahmadinejad had repeated his threat of wiping out Israel. Nuruzi, I think, rightly points to this as an instance of media manipulation and propaganda in action. Now, just by the way, Juan Cole and Arash Nuruzi are anything but partisans of the Iranian regime. Cole has written that he despises, quote, everything Ahmadinejad stands for, not to mention the odious Khomeini who had personal friends of mine killed, unquote. Well, Nuruzi ends his article, I think rather elegantly, by citing a statement of Ahmadinejad to the effect that, quote, history shows us that oppressive and cruel governments do not survive, unquote. by commenting that, quote, with this statement, Ahmadinejad has also projected the outcome of his own backwards regime, which will likewise vanish from the page of time, unquote. Nowruz's website, by the way, is mossadegh.com. You can see what he stands for. Secular democratic governance. Now, I had some comments here on the sort of theocratic orientation of Ahmadinejad and some of his stupidities. The fact that the second of the quotations I've referred to was from a speech delivered at a Tehran Holocaust conference where he rubbed shoulders with people like David Duke. Part of Ahmadinejad's stupidities, they include the fact that he is an intermittent, I would say, Holocaust denier. But it's worth noting, as of course the American press almost never does, that he's actually rather a minor player in the Iranian power structure. In writing in Foreign Affairs, Akbar Ganji says that his name wouldn't even figure among the 100 most important politicians of the last 30 years in Iran. In other words, the role of president is not what it is in a country like the United States. And the policy of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, has consistently been, quote, I'm quoting from another political scientist, that Iran's goal is not the military destruction of the Jewish state or the Jewish people, but the defeat of Zionist ideology and dissolution of Israel through a popular referendum. In Khamenei's own words, this is from 2005, quote, the solution to the issue of Palestine is to hold a referendum with the participation of all native Palestinians, including Muslims, Jews, and Christians, Palestinians who live both inside and outside the occupied territories. Any government that takes power as a result of this referendum will be an acceptable government. And President Ahmadinejad repeated that principle in his speech at Columbia University in September 2007. What we say is that to solve this 60-year problem, we must allow the Palestinian people to decide about its future for itself. We must allow Jewish Palestinians, Muslim Palestinians, and Christian Palestinians to determine their own fate themselves through a free referendum. And you can see, of course, why to politicians like Bibi Netanyahu that kind of notion would be utterly detestable. Because the result would not be a fulfillment of the Zionist project of Eretz Israel, it would be a multicultural, multi-religious democracy. So there's good reason to be skeptical. How am I doing for time? Good reason to be skeptical about the kinds of things that Netanyahu says. Iran is preparing another Holocaust for the Jewish state, unquote. Or about his demand that Ahmadinejad be tried for the crime of inciting genocide. June 2007, by the way, the US House of Representatives took the same position. There were only 2 congressional representatives who voted against a non-binding resolution asking the UN Security Council to charge Ahmadinejad under the 1948 Genocide Convention for incitement to commit genocide. Can you guess? Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul. Kucinich questioned Ahmadinejad's supposed intentions, read alternate translations of his words into the congressional record, and reminded the House of the misinformation and disinformation that had led to the Iraq War. Ron Paul pertinently asked, quote, does anyone believe that dropping nuclear weapons on Iran will not wipe a people off the map? When it is said that nothing, including a nuclear strike, is off the table on Iran, are those who say it not also threatening genocide? I think a very pertinent remark. I think Canadians ought to be skeptical about similar comments coming from our own leaders. What Gerald Kaplan calls the endlessly repeated soundbite of our Foreign Minister John Baird, quote, we believe Iran constitutes the greatest threat to peace and security in the world. And we'll lose our temper with anyone who challenges us. Baird's quite famous for losing his temper. Or similar statements from Stephen Harper. Now, the question of nuclear weapons development. I'm going to skip on a little bit. Here's a quotation from that excellent journalist, Robert Fisk, that I think is relevant. This is from 25th of January of this year. Quote, "The Israeli president, Shimon Peres, warns us now that Iran is on the cusp of producing a nuclear weapon. Heaven preserve us. Yet we reporters do not mention that Shimon Peres, as Israeli prime minister, said exactly the same thing in 1996. That was 16 years ago. And we do not recall that the current Israeli PM, Benjamin Netanyahu, said in 1992 that Iran would have a nuclear bomb by 1999. That would be 13 years ago. Same old story," unquote. Now, there's of course a distant possibility that the accusers could be right about the existence of a weapons program, but deluded as to its efficiency. Perhaps the Iranians have been trying to do this for all these years, but not trying very efficiently. But on January 8th, 2012, U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, appearing on the CBS program Face the Nation, together with General Martin Dempsey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, denied categorically that Iran had any nuclear weapons program. 10 days later, on January 18th, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz published a startling report about the presentation that Israeli intelligence would be making to General Dempsey, same guy, during his visit to Israel later that week. Quote, "The intelligent assessment Israeli officials will present later this week to Dempsey indicates that Iran has not yet decided whether to make a nuclear bomb. The Israeli view is that while Iran continues to improve its nuclear capabilities," that's become an interesting catchphrase, "it has not yet decided whether to translate these capabilities into a nuclear weapon, or more specifically, a nuclear weapon mounted atop a missile. Nor is it clear when Iran might make such a decision." Juan Cole, Middle East expert from the University of Michigan, remarked, quote, "This is the same conclusion to which the 16 U.S. intelligence agencies have come in 2007 and 2010. It is also consistent with what the Iranian government itself says, which is that the Iranian nuclear enrichment program is a civilian one and that Iran is not trying to construct a nuclear weapon. Likewise, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which I may have more to say later or perhaps in question,